probably assume that when you get old, something will catch you. Some system, some account, some monthly payment that keeps the lights on after your body gives out. That assumption is so deeply wired into your brain that you've never questioned it. But for the vast majority of human history, thousands and thousands of years, nothing caught you. There was no system, no fund, no safety net. When you couldn't work anymore, your options were simple and terrifying. Depend on your children, beg, or die. The pension, the idea that society owes you income after a certain age, is one of the newest inventions in human civilization. Newer than the steam engine, newer than the telegraph, and the systems people relied on before it existed didn't disappear because something better replaced them. They were destroyed by factories, by cities, by an economic revolution that shattered the oldest safety net on Earth and left millions of elderly people with nothing. By the end of this, you'll know exactly how humanity survived old age for millennia without pensions, what demolished those survival systems, and why the world might be quietly circling back to the same terrifying conditions your great-great-grandparents lived in. Your children were your pension. For most of human history, retirement wasn't a phase of life. It wasn't a goal. It wasn't something you planned for. The word didn't exist. You worked until your body failed, and then you depended entirely on the people you had raised. Your children were your pension plan. That wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal economic arrangement, and entire civilizations were built around it. In ancient China, this arrangement had a name: filial piety. It wasn't just a cultural tradition, it was law. Confucian teachings placed the care of aging parents at the very center of moral life, and imperial codes enforced it. A son who abandoned his elderly parents could be punished by the state, not because the government was generous, but because a parent without support became a burden on everyone else. The law didn't protect the elderly out of compassion. It protected the system from the cost of their abandonment. In ancient Rome, the legal code was equally explicit. The Code of Justinian, the foundation of Roman civil law, stated plainly that a judge could order a son to provide food and support to his aging parent, provided the son had the means. Roman veterans might receive a plot of land or a payment after decades of military service, but that was a reward for killing on behalf of the empire, not a retirement system. For everyone else, merchants, farmers, freed slaves, there was family, or there was nothing. In ancient Egypt, the elderly held a status that might surprise a modern person. Old age was treated as evidence of divine favor. If you'd lived that long, the gods must have valued you. Aging parents were absorbed into their children's households, not as charity cases, but as repositories of knowledge, oral historians of the family line, and spiritual links between the living and the dead. The system wasn't selfless, it was practical. In a civilization without written records for most people, the elderly were the record. Lose them, and you lost your story. In ancient Greece, the arrangement ran on shame more than law. Neglecting your elderly parents was considered one of the deepest moral failures a person could commit. Athenian courts could hear cases of elder neglect, and a citizen found guilty of mistreating his aging father could lose his civil rights. Aristotle held deeply negative views about old age. He wrote that the elderly were suspicious, cynical, and small-minded. But even Aristotle didn't argue they should be abandoned. The social fabric depended on the compact between generations holding firm. Break it, and the whole structure trembled. Yet none of these arrangements were what they seemed on the surface. They weren't evidence that ancient societies cared deeply about their elders. They were evidence that ancient societies had no alternative. When you strip away the cultural language, the Confucian virtue, the Roman law, the Greek shame, what remains is a raw economic truth. The family took care of the old because if the family didn't, nobody would. There was no institution, no fund, no collective system that existed beyond the household. The family wasn't choosing to be the safety net. It was the only net there was. In medieval Europe, the pattern held. You farmed the land, you raised children. And when your hands couldn't hold the plow, you handed the farm to your eldest son and hoped he'd keep feeding you. There was no contract, no guarantee, just the expectation that blood would take care of blood, and the quiet understanding that if it didn't, your final years would be brutal. This system worked, more or less, for millennia. It wasn't fair, and it certainly wasn't reliable. It held because it was the only option, and because the conditions of agrarian life made it functional. Families lived together. Multiple generations shared the same house, the same land, the same economic unit. Grandparents watched children while parents worked the fields. Everyone contributed something, even if it was just experience and knowledge of when to plant and when to harvest. The elderly weren't just dependents. They were part of the labor force of the household, participating in ways that didn't require peak physical strength. The system had a fatal flaw, though. It depended on two things being true: that families stayed together and that families stayed in one place. The moment either of those conditions broke, the entire arrangement collapsed, and both conditions shattered at the same time. The guilds and the brotherhoods before that collapse, another system existed alongside the family, one that most people today have never heard of. Starting in the medieval period, craft guilds in Europe functioned as something remarkably close to an early insurance network. If you were a weaver, a blacksmith, a baker, or a cobbler, your guild wasn't just a trade association. It was a mutual protection society. Members paid dues. In return, the guild provided support during illness, covered burial costs when a member died, and, in some cases, offered modest ongoing support to a member's widow and orphaned children. This wasn't charity. It was a deal. You paid in during your productive years, and the collective absorbed some of the risk of your worst years. The structure was simple, local, and self-governing. It didn't depend on a king or a government or a distant institution. It depended on a group of people in the same trade, in the same town, agreeing to share the burden. Not every guild provided elder care, and the protections varied enormously from one trade and one city to the next. A wealthy goldsmith's guild in London offered far more than a weaver's guild in a provincial town, but the principle was consistent. You didn't face disaster alone. The group absorbed some of the shock. By the 16th century in England, these structures had evolved into what were called friendly societies, voluntary associations where working people pooled money to cover sickness, old age, and death expenses. By the early 1800s, 1 out of every 9 English men belonged to one. They were everywhere. No reformer designed them. Ordinary people looked at the risks of life and built their own crude safety nets, dollar by dollar, shilling by shilling. When the concept crossed the Atlantic, it exploded. In 19th century America, fraternal organizations became one of the dominant institutions of working-class life. The Freemasons arrived in 1730, the Odd Fellows in 1819, the Elks in 1868, the Moose in 1888, the Eagles in 1898. By 1910, roughly 1/3 of all adult American men belonged to a fraternal lodge of some kind. These weren't social clubs where men sat around drinking. They were survival networks. Lodges provided sickness insurance. If you couldn't work because of illness or injury, the lodge paid a weekly benefit. They provided death benefits so your family wouldn't be destitute when you died. Some operated orphanages, hospitals, job exchanges, and homes for elderly members. The Loyal Order of Moose ran Mooseheart, an entire community near Aurora, Illinois, dedicated to caring for the children of deceased members. The Security Benefit Association built a hospital, an elderly home, and an orphanage near Topeka, Kansas. African Americans, excluded from white lodges by racism, built their own. The Independent Order of St. Luke, founded by former slaves, became so successful that it established its own bank, the St. Luke Penny Savings Bank, in 1903. The United Order of True Reformers provided sickness and burial insurance to Black communities across the South when no one else would. What made these organizations remarkable wasn't their size, although their size was extraordinary. It was what they represented. Ordinary people, without any government mandate, without any corporate structure, without any formal economic theory, had looked at the problem of survival and built their own solution. They taxed themselves. They created rules. They established benefits. They governed their own institutions. The lodge system was, in effect, a grassroots welfare state, invented from below, funded by the people who needed it, and run by the people who used it. These fraternal networks were, in many ways, the pension system that existed before pensions existed. They weren't perfect. They didn't cover everyone. Women were largely excluded from the major lodges until organizations like the Ladies of the Maccabees carved out space for all female membership with their own benefits, including surgical care. The system was limited to those who could afford dues and who happened to live near an active lodge. But for tens of millions of people, They were the difference between surviving a crisis and being destroyed by one. The lodges, too, were dismantled, not by a single event, but by a slow erosion that began in the early 20th century. Commercial insurance companies saw the fraternal market and wanted it. Medical associations pressured doctors who worked with lodges. The rise of radio and movies gave people new ways to spend their evenings, and lodge attendance declined. Most importantly, the expanding welfare state, mothers' pensions, workers' compensation, eventually Social Security, replaced the functions that fraternal organizations had served. By the 1930s, the lodge system was in irreversible decline. Something important gets lost in this history. The fraternal lodge wasn't just an insurance provider, it was a community. Members knew each other. They visited each other when sick. They showed up at funerals. They made decisions together about who needed help and how much. The system had a human face. When it was replaced by a government program, impersonal, bureaucratic, administered by strangers through forms and formulas, something intangible was lost. The check arrived, but nobody came to the door. Whether the replacement was an upgrade or a loss depends entirely on what happened next. The machine that broke the family. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how people worked. It obliterated the conditions that had made old age survival possible for thousands of years. Before industrialization, most people in Europe and North America lived in rural areas. In 1790, roughly 90% of Americans lived on farms. Families were large. Children were labor, plain and simple. Every pair of hands helped with the harvest, the livestock, the daily survival of the household. And when the older generation could no longer do heavy labor, they stayed. The farm was big enough. The house had room. The family unit absorbed them because the family unit needed them. Industrialization ripped that apart with a violence that nobody at the time fully understood. Factories didn't need families. They needed individuals. Young, strong, mobile workers who could move to where the machines were. And the machines were in cities. The factory whistle didn't care if your mother was sick. The foreman didn't care that your father had no one to bring him water. The wage economy valued one thing: output per hour. Everything that didn't serve production was irrelevant. The migration happened fast. In 1890, only about 35% of Americans lived in urban areas. By 1920, just 30 years later, more Americans lived in cities than on farms for the first time in the nation's history. By 1930, 56% were urban. The same pattern played out across England, Germany, France, and eventually the entire industrialized world. Young people left the countryside in enormous numbers. They moved into cramped tenement apartments in Manchester, Pittsburgh, Berlin, New York. They took factory jobs that paid wages. Actual money, not crops. But those wages barely covered rent and food for a single person, let alone an extended family. The apartment had 2 rooms. There was no space for grandparents. There was no farm to share. There was no role for an elderly person in a factory economy that priced human beings by their physical output per hour. The elderly who stayed behind in the countryside found themselves on shrinking farms with fewer hands to help. The elderly who followed their children to the cities found themselves useless in an economy that had no place for them. The family safety net, the one that had held for millennia, didn't just weaken. It was structurally impossible to maintain under the new conditions. And at the same time, something else was happening that made the crisis worse. People were living longer. Between 1900 and 1930, average life expectancy in the United States increased by 10 years. The most rapid expansion in recorded human history. More people were reaching old age than ever before, and the systems designed to support them in old age had just been demolished. Consider what this meant in human terms. A woman in 1910 who had spent her life on a farm in Ohio, whose children had moved to Cleveland for factory work, whose husband had died at 58 from a heart attack. What were her options? She couldn't run the farm alone. She couldn't move to the city and find work. Factories didn't hire 60-year-old women. Her children's apartment had 2 rooms. Her lodge didn't exist out in the countryside. Her church could offer a meal, maybe 2. After that, there was the poorhouse. This collision, longer lives and fewer family supports, created a crisis that had no precedent. For the first time in human history, Massive numbers of elderly people existed with no family nearby, no land to sustain them, no guild to fall back on, no lodge to draw from, and no way to earn a living. The old world's safety nets had been ripped away, and nothing had been built to replace them. The poorhouse. The response to this crisis was not compassion. It was containment. By the mid-1800s, nearly every county in the United States had a poorhouse, sometimes called an almshouse. These were the institutions where the destitute elderly ended up when every other option had been exhausted. And the conditions inside them were designed, deliberately and specifically, to be as miserable as possible. Residents lost their property rights. They lost their right to vote. In some jurisdictions, they lost their freedom of movement. They couldn't leave without permission. In certain places, poorhouse residents were required to wear a large letter P on their clothing, marking them publicly as paupers. They were housed alongside the mentally ill, the disabled, alcoholics, and sometimes petty criminals. There was no separation by condition or need. The old, the sick, and the disturbed were packed into the same overcrowded dormitories. This wasn't neglect born of poverty. This was policy born of philosophy. The cruelty was intentional. The principle behind the poorhouse, inherited from the English poor laws, was deterrence. If the conditions inside the poorhouse were terrible enough, people would do anything to avoid ending up there. The system punished poverty to discourage it, as though poverty were a character defect and not an economic condition. In England, the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act formalized this principle into statute. Workhouses were required to maintain conditions worse than the worst conditions available outside their walls. The theory was called less eligibility. Life inside the institution had to be less eligible, less desirable, than the most desperate existence outside it. Families were separated upon entry. Husbands, wives, and children were housed in different wings and forbidden from seeing each other. The elderly died in these places, alone, on straw mattresses, in unheated rooms. This was the best the most advanced economies on Earth could offer their elderly citizens. Work until you drop, or we'll warehouse you in conditions designed to humiliate. By the time the Great Depression hit in the 1930s, the situation was catastrophic. Over half of elderly Americans lacked sufficient income to support themselves. Only about 5% of the elderly were receiving any kind of retirement pension. State pension programs existed in about 30 states by 1935, but they were so poorly funded and so restrictively administered that only about 3% of the elderly actually received benefits. The average payment was roughly 65 cents per day. 1 in 2 seniors was impoverished, not 1 in 10, not 1 in 5, 1 in 2. The richest country in the history of the world was failing half its elderly population. And the options available to those people, charity, family, institutional care, were the same options that had been available in medieval England. 5 centuries of economic progress and old age looked exactly the same for the people at the bottom. The fix that froze. The invention of state-run pensions. Beginning with Bismarck's Germany in 1889 and spreading through the Social Security Act in the United States in 1935 and similar systems across Europe and Asia in the decades that followed, was a response to this crisis. Governments didn't create pensions because they had a vision of dignified old age. They created pensions because the alternative, millions of destitute elderly people filling poorhouses, dying in the streets, and potentially radicalizing, was politically unbearable. The pension system that emerged in the mid-20th century rested on a specific set of conditions. Birth rates were high, producing a large base of young workers paying into the system. Life expectancies were rising, but still kept retirement periods short. A man retiring at 65 in 1950 might collect for 8 or 10 years. The ratio of workers to retirees was enormous. In the United States in 1950, there were roughly 16 workers for every one retiree drawing Social Security. For about 4 decades, the 1950s through the 1980s, the math worked. Corporations offered defined benefit pensions. Governments funded Social Security systems comfortably. The retirement dream solidified. Work for 30 years, collect a pension, sit on your porch. It felt permanent. It felt like how things had always been. But it was an anomaly, a brief golden window that depended on conditions already starting to unravel. The unraveling. Today, every single variable that made pensions sustainable has reversed. People live dramatically longer. A person retiring at 65 now can reasonably expect to live another 20 years. Some will live 30 or more. That's not a decade of pension payments. That's a generation's worth of income without labor to fund it. Birth rates across the developed world have collapsed. In South Korea, the fertility rate hit 0.72 in 2023, the lowest ever recorded by any country in human history. Japan, Germany, Italy, Spain, all are aging rapidly while their working-age populations shrink. The worker-to-retiree ratio across developed economies has plummeted, from double digits in the 1950s to about 4.1 in 2010, with projections putting it at 2.1 by 2050. For every retiree drawing payments, there will be barely 2 workers paying in. The numbers are staggering. The combined retirement savings gap across just the 6 largest pension systems, the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, the Netherlands, Canada, and Australia, is projected to reach $224 trillion by 2050. That shortfall grows by roughly $28 billion every single day. In the United States alone, the gap accounts for $137 trillion of that total. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to deplete by 2033, at which point benefits would be automatically cut by 23% unless Congress acts. Meanwhile, the private pension has all but vanished. Companies have replaced defined benefit pensions, where the employer bore the investment risk and guaranteed you income for life, with defined contribution plans like the 401k, where the risk sits entirely on you. If the market crashes the year you retire, that's your problem. If your savings run out at 82, that's your problem too. By 2023, only about 15% of private sector workers in the United States still had access to a traditional pension, down from 38% in 1980. 40% of Americans approaching retirement age have saved nothing at all, zero. The average individual shortfall across the 6 major pension economies is approximately $300,000. These are people who have worked their entire lives, paid taxes, followed the rules, and will reach old age without enough money to sustain themselves. The gig economy has accelerated the collapse. Tens of millions of workers worldwide now operate as independent contractors, drivers, delivery workers, freelancers, with no employer-sponsored retirement plan, no matching contributions, and no institutional structure pushing them to save. They're earning day to day, which is exactly how people earned before pensions existed. The difference is that a medieval farmer owned land he could live on when his strength gave out. A modern gig worker owns a phone and a rating score that expires the moment they stop delivering. Think about that parallel. Before pensions, you worked until your body broke and then depended on family. After pensions, in the brief golden window, a system caught you. Now, for a growing percentage of the workforce, the system is thinning to nothing, and the family structures that used to serve as backup have never recovered from the fragmentation that industrialization caused 2 centuries ago. The average American moves 11 times in their lifetime. Extended families are scattered across time zones. Adult children are themselves struggling with housing costs, student debt, and stagnant wages. The idea that they'll absorb the financial burden of an aging parent the way a medieval farming family did is a fantasy that has no relationship to modern economic reality. The circle closes. Pull the lens back and trace what happened. For thousands of years, people survived old age through family. The family was the pension. Children cared for parents because custom demanded it, law enforced it, and the structure of agrarian life made it practical. Alongside the family, guilds, lodges, and fraternal organizations provided an additional layer, thin, imperfect, but real. These systems were local, personal, and self-sustaining. Then industrialization destroyed both. It pulled young people out of family homes and into cities. It replaced agrarian economies with wage economies where your value expired with your body. It shattered multi-generational households into nuclear units too small and too poor to absorb a non-working elder. And it turned old age from a shared family responsibility into an individual economic problem. The pension was invented to fill the gap, not as an act of generosity, as a political response to a crisis that couldn't be ignored. Bismarck needed to prevent revolution. Roosevelt needed to stabilize a collapsing economy. Every government that followed needed to manage a growing population of elderly people who had nowhere else to turn. For a few decades, the math held. Workers paid in, retirees drew out, and the balance stayed positive. Companies competed for employees partly by offering better pensions. Governments expanded coverage. The retirement age became a cultural milestone, a finish line that workers could see and plan around. Entire industries grew up around the concept: retirement communities, financial planning, leisure travel for seniors. The pension wasn't just an economic mechanism anymore. It was a way of life. And then the math stopped holding. Now look at where we are. The state pension is under pressure everywhere. The private pension has been replaced by savings accounts that most people can't fill. The gig economy is producing a workforce with no retirement infrastructure at all. Family structures have fragmented further. People live alone in greater numbers than at any point in history. The fraternal lodge is dead. The church charity network is a shadow of what it was. The safety nets that existed before pensions are gone, and the pension itself is cracking. We are slowly, and without most people realizing it, returning to the conditions that existed before 1889. A world where stopping work means running out of money, where old age is an economic cliff, not a reward, where the gap between people who can afford to stop working and people who can't becomes the defining inequality of a generation. In India, where pension coverage reaches fewer than 30% of the workforce, 320 million people will be over 60 by 2050, the largest mass of unprotected elderly in human history. In South Korea, nearly 40% of people over 65 already live in poverty, the highest rate in the developed world. In the United States, the generation that watched their grandparents retire comfortably on company pensions will spend their own old age calculating whether they can afford to stop working at 70 or 75 or ever. The question your great-grandparents faced, "How do I afford to stop working?" is becoming your question again. The pension era, which lasted roughly a century, may turn out to be the anomaly, not the norm. A brief experiment in collective responsibility that emerged from a specific crisis, flourished under specific demographic conditions, and is now unraveling as those conditions reverse. Your grandparents might have been the only generation in all of human history that could genuinely afford to stop working. They weren't smarter or more disciplined. They happened to live during the one window when the math worked and the institutions held. That window may already be closing. For 10,000 years of civilization, the answer to "how will I survive when I'm old?" was the same. Your family, your children, the people whose lives you built. That answer wasn't perfect, it wasn't fair, but it was something. Then the factories came and the families scattered. The guilds died. The lodges emptied. Then the pensions came, and for a few decades, there was a system, a promise, a number in your head that meant freedom. Now the pensions are cracking, and the families haven't come back. The lodges are museums. The guilds are footnotes. And the question nobody wants to ask out loud is whether we're heading back to where we started. A world where getting old without money isn't a policy problem. It's a death sentence. If this changed how you think about the invisible promise you've been counting on, subscribe. We trace the hidden origins of the rules you live by and show you who wrote them.